Were you in good shape, Lacey? All right, well, it looks like things are going, so we will get started. Thanks to everyone who's here, and we appreciate you pardoning our delay. We're excited to get started with our second session of Something Different in the Garden. And this is a series where we're looking at 18th century influences in the garden, be they African, European, or indigenous. And we're considering those influences then and then today. And we're talking about crops, techniques, and ideas, and how those continue to shape our gardens. Today, we're going to be zeroing in on some of the indigenous aspects, and we have two fantastic guests with us. We have Chef Dave Smoke McCluskey, a Mohawk chef, indigenous foodways educator, and food innovator and entrepreneur. We have Stephen Smith, the director of the Roughwood Table seed collection. He's an author, and he's involved in just about everything that goes into preserving the remarkable diversity of seeds that we inherit from the past. So both of these speakers have tremendous knowledge, and what I really appreciate about both of them is just how practical they are and how they approach it and share it with everyone. Before they introduce themselves, I'm going to offer a quick framework to help us kind of contextualize this discussion and Gunston Hall. And really what I'm talking about are two themes, history and this idea of rights that George Mason sees as very important. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Gunston Hall, 1780s and 1770s, that's our time period. And so what's important here is to really understand that time period. You have to definitely look and understand the indigenous agricultural legacy that is so important to that moment. So at sites like Gunston Hall, where crops like tobacco were economically important and crops like corn provided this main food stay, was a staple crop. Those things give us a really important insight because they really are what organized the day-to-day of the community at Gunston Hall. So George Mason, but also the enslaved, the renters, and the indentured servants who are all working here. And so you have this kind of weird moment where these folks who identified as Englishmen were calling for their rights, and yet their lives were organized by indigenous crops, again, like corn and tobacco. And among those rights is the right to own property, and that's specifically land. George Mason certainly owned a lot of land. And these moments then exist kind of on a continuum because George Mason's able to inherit so much property because the previous generations of Masons were involved in the conflicts whereby Anglo peoples were able to dispossess and displace some of the indigenous population. And at Gunston Hall, that was the Mayumse. And they were in a really interesting situation because they had to sort of navigate two powerful native confederacies, both the Haudenosaunee and the Powhatan to the south. And so they were operating within that. So essentially, while George Mason maybe not have had a lot of opportunities to interact with indigenous people, he certainly had a lot to gain from the ongoing conflicts that would continue to characterize these two groups' relationships. He had a lot of land in Ohio. And so there's that contradiction at play in the moments where he's, speaking for these rights and advocating, like the Virginia Ratifying Convention and the Constitutional Convention. So he doesn't always act on his convictions in the ways that we might hope. What's also important is that idea of rights. In the 18th century, these are very narrow, and we know that we've expanded and built upon them, and so many have contributed to this work. And some of those ideas we'll get at today, especially the idea of sovereignty, which I'll let our speakers define, but we may think of this as sort of control, access to, and the right to choose what is appropriate for a given community. And most specifically, indigenous communities have really contributed to this evolving dialogue of rights by articulating and working towards seed and food sovereignty. So that's sort of the framework. I don't want to share too much more and tread on the toes of our excellent speakers. Stephen, if you don't mind, please introduce yourself, share a little bit about your work, and then Chef Dave, if you don't mind, you're welcome to do the same. And then we'll launch into our conversation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Smith. As Ryan said, I am the manager and curator for the Ruffwood Seed Collection. I am the director for the Roughwood Table and the upcoming Roughwood Foundation. We are located in Devon, Pennsylvania, and we are an educational nonprofit organization donated to preserving heirloom seed, indigenous seed, the seed collection that is part of Ruffwood itself. We have over 5,000 edible food plants from all over the world. These are anything from indigenous seeds such as corn, beans, and squash, to other heirlooms that are just found throughout the world, whether they be edible flowers, whether they're herbs. And what we do at Ruffwood is we document the history of these varieties as best as we can. And we keep the seed renewed and we keep the seed going, all the while promoting heirloom seed, seed sovereignty, and keeping the idea of human interaction with seed and the culture that is associated with each seed alive and well. That's really our philosophy, because to us, seeds are not only history and culture, they're edible folk art. They are what makes a culture. So Dave, if you want to take over from here.
Hi, I'm Dave Smoke McCluskey. I'm a Mohawk chef, educator, and owner of the recently formed Corn Mafiahominy, kind of a company designed to promote the somewhat dying art of making hominy, which all indigenous folks did with the majority of their corn before eating it. So it's really promoting a little bit more healthy lifestyle. It makes it easier to digest, absorb nutrients that are locked in the corn, and vitamins that are locked in the corn that otherwise wouldn't be available to us to eat. So it's really a healthier way to eat corn, and I'm promoting that as part of a Three Sisters diet, which we just mentioned a little bit. So corn, bean, and squash are our main focus of mine. There's an ongoing book that keeps getting written and rewritten. So I get ideas and rewrite things and change things around. So it's a kind of an ongoing project, and this hominy company is kind of an offshoot of that. Just kind of realizing that I need to be able to source things for people to eat. A lot of the older generation has stopped processing hominy, as well as a lot of the older farmers do not grow as much of our corn as we used to, for sure. This endeavor is to try to encourage folks to eat that corn, but to get farmers as well to grow this corn. And hominy for me allows me to help control the seed sovereignty, which I think is a particularly nice thing for some folks to hear, that feel certain ways about their seeds. So we talked a lot about the culture and whatnot, but there's also a spiritual aspect to a lot of that as well. So there are those of us that believe all of that has spirit and it needs to be protected at times. I also go a step further because I'm a chef and realize that corn has its own duty, beans has its own duty, squash to nourish and feed the people. So seed saving is one great step, but the next step is to feed the people with that seed. So I tend to see seed saving in smaller farms as a way to preserve things, but they're almost a closed system at times unless we start to grow those in greater numbers. But how do we grow those in greater numbers and protect the seeds? Well, we turn it into hominy, and we do a few other things that are possible with these foods. So most of our foods are all out in the open anyway. So. But that's just kind of what I do. And I travel a bit to food events and whatnot and kind of teach people how to make hominy and nixtamalized corn and do all the things that can be done with it from there.
Well, that's what's so fantastic about both of your work is how you kind of can connect the dots in terms of being seed keepers, and then your work, Dave, with making that a viable process and getting into the hands of growers and then making it a product that they can use. So we kind of got at that idea, Dave, and what you were saying in terms of food and seed sovereignty. I'm really curious how you both define these ideas and why they are so important to your work.
Steve, you want to go or I can?
You can go first.
Okay. Well, seed and food sovereignty to me is that we kind of have to. If any of you follow me on any of the social media platforms, we talk about appropriation. I've got an ongoing thing right now talking about spiritual appropriation, and some of us, because we're animists, we're not Christians and whatnot. We believe that all things are connected, all things have spirit. So to protect the seeds is protecting family. To protect the food is protecting a valid foodway, if you will, or a cultural aspect of our people. So if you look at things, 60% or more of the world's crops are indigenous to the Americas. That's a pretty interesting thing, but a lot of people, they don't remember that anymore. So sovereignty, I think, can play a role in some of that. So with the reclamation of our goods, I get in trouble sometimes with friends because I remind them that peanuts are not African, nor are sweet potatoes, things like that. So I'm kind of here as an educator to help people not forget who things belong to or what supposedly savage cultures cultivated. And there's a lot of science that's kind of involved in that that's different than the European construct of science. So I talk about that a lot and educate, a lot about it and believe in it. To a certain degree, I think it can be carried too far at times, but I think I just talked about kind of seed sovereignty with Mafiahominy. So that's one of those things that's a stopgap for me to hopefully put more corn out there than just the 3 or 4 that are grown commercially for use and taste. Stephen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. My view of both seed and food sovereignty, more so seed sovereignty, is like what Dave was saying. To me, seed sovereignty is reclaiming the biodiversity that we have, remembering that most of the crops and the foods that we eat here in America today are indigenous to the Americas. Even the plants that give us fiber like cotton and everything is indigenous to the Americas. Potatoes, tomatoes, corn, beans, squash, all of that is indigenous to the Americas. And these were the original plants, the original food plants that have sustained the indigenous peoples of the Americas for thousands of years. This was their culture. These were their food plants and medicine plants. This is what they were given by the Creator, and this is what they were to both steward and protect, as well as the land, and just keep this very spiritual balance between basically being a steward of the land and these plants and animals, while ensuring that the spiritual aspects that were connected to a lot of these plants and animals were also followed. Because when you look at it over the past century, here in the Americas alone, we've lost about between 75 and probably 80–90% of the original heirloom plants that existed just 200 or 300 years ago. Over 3/4 of the crops that are grown today are controlled by large corporations. Most of these, especially things like corn, this is why what Dave does is so important, because what Dave is growing can be saved. You can grow it, you can save your own seed, you can eat it, and you know it's nutritional. The stuff that is in circulation today that's grown in most cornfields across even the world, it's usually genetically modified, and it is usually either it produces sterile plants, which you won't get any seed from, or it is patented or copyrighted, and you cannot save the seed of it. And that's, to me, that's what food sovereignty also is. It's reclaiming our original ancestral right to save our own seed, because it's what we've done for thousands of years. And it's been only over the course of the last couple centuries that we've lost we've lost that ability because the giant corporations have told us that we can't save our own seed, that there's better and bigger things out there, and that they should own the seed. And one big part of seed sovereignty is that no one really owns the seed in terms of ownership. It's kind of public ownership. It's public domain with certain aspects of respect in it. But that's what seed sovereignty is to me and to us at Roughwood.
Oh, thanks. That's really fantastic. What I think is really interesting is how important just getting the information out was in both of your responses, just being aware of where certain crops come from, being aware of some of the stories associated with them. And that's what's kind of cool too about what folks are doing in a regular basis in their gardens. You know, maybe they see these crops differently as they learn more about them. One of the next things that we wanted to talk about was really how we know what we know about foodways and crops. So if you don't mind, could you guys both share a little bit about the work you do researching or even some of the stories that contribute to your knowledge of the seeds you work with?
Yeah, it's when you in certain aspects of at least what we do at Roughwood, it's not always easy to find the information that we have on the varieties. A lot of the information that we are able to share and inform people about, we use various sources. Of course, now that we're in the modern era, there's a lot of things that are now digitized. But a lot of our stuff comes from old seed catalogs, which before the modern era, when more of the selling propaganda was put in, you actually had the history of the variety, where the seed was originated, who created it, and all of this stuff. So old seed catalogs from like the 1900s are a big and valuable resource. Of course, we have physical copies, but now that everything is basically online, we also have the digital versions too. But we also have been interviewing people. A lot of the seeds we have come from specific individuals, whether they're just at-home seed savers. A lot of the indigenous seed that we have came from our indigenous contacts and people that I know in the seed saving community, and we interview them. We have them just inform us whatever they can tell us about the variety, because some of these seeds, they are exceedingly sacred, and we respect that we may not be able to be informed about certain rituals or aspects that the seed may be involved in. But at least we try to figure out what we can do with the variety. Is it edible? Is it just ornamental? Is it just a ceremonial variety? And we also just have old books, old manuscripts that were written. There were a lot of agriculturalists and people within certain scientific foundations. Here in Philadelphia, we're famous for the Bartrams that scoured much of the eastern U.S. as botanists. They interviewed a lot of the Cherokee, because I have Cherokee blood in my family and Creek blood. And we have their journals. We use personal journals from these explorers, from the actual individuals that we get seed from as well, because a lot of these people kept records of everything. We interview as many people as we can. Of course, a lot of the varieties that we have, the elders or the people that knew them are sadly not with us anymore. And we just sometimes it just comes up to us just going on the internet and Googling something and seeing what comes up. But we try to use our physical documentation to be able to track the history and to know what we know about the variety. We don't always have luck with something like that, but really, to us, the best source of information for us has been just talking with someone directly, because when you hear it, as the old saying is, when you get it directly from the horse's mouth, there's no way that it can really be falsified or everything, because one problem that Dave can also probably mention is that when you have these people that interview the indigenous nations across the US, there is some racial problems. There is a looking down upon them as some kind of wild man. And the Western ideals has really reshaped how a lot of the knowledge about, especially indigenous seeds, has been kept. A lot of it was just never written down or never shared with the people that were outsiders. But for us, it's sometimes hard to sort through this racial slurring that happens with the information, and the bias that ends up happening because of that. But we realize that we will encounter that, so it doesn't surprise us when we do. But we try to approach things from a neutral, non-negative perspective. But it's not an easy thing to do. But again, getting it from someone directly, the information from someone directly, is a very invaluable resource. There is a squash that we got from a Nanticoke elder here in Delaware, and she ended up giving it to us, and she ended up passing away not long after she did. So we never got to interview her about the varieties, or the varieties more so, because what she gave us ended up being nearly about probably 80–90% of all of the indigenous squash that were probably grown by the Lenape here in Pennsylvania, the Nanticokes, the Muncie, all of them up here. So we have over probably 2 or 3 dozen different indigenous squash varieties now, because of what the seed that she gave us, that she had stewarded for who knows how long. She was in her 90s, so we don't really know how long she had them because we didn't get to talk to her. But we have a watercolor book of paintings that was done by a squash obsessed botanist, Antoine Duchesne, who was in touch with the Bartrams and all of the other botanists and seed companies here in Pennsylvania and across the eastern US. And he was getting all of these indigenous squash seed from all of the nations across the indigenous nations across the eastern seaboard here, eastern woodlands. And they were sending them to him in France, and he was growing these and producing giant watercolor paintings, full color, every inch of detail that you could ever imagine on these squash. So we know that these squash were here before the Revolutionary War, because these paintings were done prior to that period. But so that has been an invaluable resource, especially to squash, because usually if it's not in his paintings, it probably did not exist at that point. But there are indigenous varieties that we have that are not in the book, but we know are old. But one of the sad things is that manuscript that went with his paintings, the publishers in France, they didn't want it, so they told him, well, throw the manuscript out, we just want the paintings. So we have no idea what he knew about these squash, which is even worse. So a lot of this squash, we're trying to get in touch with indigenous seed keepers and just trying to figure out what we have, because this is one of the problems that we sometimes encounter, is that we can't find information. So here we are trying to dig up every bit that we can. But I'll let Dave get into it now.
Real quick, that's such an amazing story, and full of frustration. But I also 2 or 3 dozen types of squash maintained by one. That's unbelievable. Just the dance that it would have taken, and the spacing requirements for squash is so challenging so that they don't crossbreed. I mean, that's just mind blowing. What a tremendous person.
Yeah, it was so astounding to us, because she didn't tell us what she gave us. She said, just keep these squash going. They are our indigenous varieties, because the Nanticokes they're kind of a wetland swamp people. They've inhabited the marshes that's up here for hundreds of years, thousands of years. So these are squash that would have been grown in floodplains and wetlands, which is where squash was originally grown. But when we first planted these squash, she didn't give them to us as separate varieties. She just gave us a handful of seed. So when we planted them, we thought we were going to get 1 or 2 varieties, but we had like over 2 or 3 dozen that just randomly appeared. So we've been trying to sort all of these out and everything, while also keeping in mind that not every indigenous nation kept their squash as solely separate varieties. A lot of indigenous seeds, they are kind of a mixture, just because it was easier to sort them out when they were ready to eat. Some were better as summer squash, and some were better as using as gourds, such as to make bowls or spoons with, or to bake with, to hollow out. And they sorted it out when the harvest came in. They didn't necessarily keep certain varieties separate unless they were a sacred. Usually if they were a sacred variety used for rattles or something, they were. But yeah, these squash they're one of my favorite things to grow, because every time we grow them, we usually get another type that will pop out of them. That's just the biodiversity that's within this squash. And that's the way these old seeds are. It's that not only do they all taste different, they all are so unique and so beautiful that it's astounding that what we have that just came out of a handful of about 25, 30 seed that we were originally given.
Yeah, a lot of what I do is very similar to Stephen, where you're hoping to talk to people, you're reading, the internet does make things a lot easier than it used to be. But what I've realized, very similar to Stephen, is you kind of have to put them through a a racial filter, if you will. So there's a lot of racial bias that goes on to a lot of the historical things that you read, because they're not those indigenous voices that are important to learning about some of these things. They're people not of our culture writing about our culture, and frequently they weren't very well written, or they weren't scientists, or they weren't people that were really making great observations. They were just making observations in journals that may be part of trade, or maybe part of a soldier's journal, or letters home. So you have to kind of filter a lot of that stuff, and it's unfortunate. But as a chef, what I have to do is I have to interpret things and see things, how they would be cooked, or how they would not be cooked even at times, or how unrealistic some of the views that I'm reading are, and some of the things that fellow people that are part of our culture or study our culture kind of believe because they were written. And you kind of go, oh, wait a minute, like fermented corn, like softki and things like that. My people have lost all of that stuff. So what I was curious was to come across that and find, it was a Frenchman of some sorts, maybe a Jesuit, but talking about a putrid corn or rotted corn, and his description, it was thrown in a puddle and left to fester for several months, and then they took, they had great joy in eating it and whatnot. But what you realize as you view things as spiritual beings and almost religious objects, you're going to realize pretty quickly that no people that revered corn as much as they do would throw it in a mud puddle and let it fester for months at a time, nor do puddles last for that long. So these are some of the things that you kind of have to filter through. And I think some of that fermenting was a turnoff to Europeans, because it wasn't something that they were used to versus something that we may have been used to. Kind of to put that in a context, I was listening to a story once, and they were talking about some, I think it was French, but they were basically lost in the wilderness, and as usual didn't bring enough supplies along with them, and didn't know how to forage for supplies here in America, and came across I believe it was a woods bison dead, dead in a pool of water, so a small pond or whatever. And because they were starving, they ate it and they enjoyed it, which, really points directly to me at a cultural difference there that most people would not have eaten that out of the water like that, where, the Europeans didn't have a problem with it because they were hungry, but they enjoyed it with great gusto. So would that be any smellier than, say, rotted corn? I would probably think so, for fermented corn. So, you would call that lacto fermenting, which is what we do with a lot of things. It's what we do with cabbages. So Corn, I've done it several different ways here. I've got friends that are kind of in the whole miso movement and koji and whatnot, and I have corn misos in my possession. I've had corn vinegars, amazakes, and all kinds of fun things that tamari, which is kind of like a soy sauce. And you taste those things, but when I tasted the fermented white corn that I used, it reminded me of miso. So when I tasted these miso after that, I was like, oh, wow. So from a chef standpoint, you kind of grasp flavors or what things may taste like after getting funky. And you can kind of think about it from the other, I say sometimes taste memories that you have in your brain. So that taste memory might go, oh, well, those things taste similar. Those things smell similar. What are these things? And to be honest with you, the fermented white corn that I did for, I think it was about a month and a half, smelled a lot like the beautiful sweet corn miso that I love. Super similar. So my thought process was right in the beginning of that. Well, are these ferments kind of used in the style that these other fermented things with, where the aminos are popping out of the flavor and things like that. So that kind of proved to be correct. I don't have as much interest in it as I did because I've solved the problem. So that's me a lot of the time. I think of things and I wonder if this is how we did it. So a lot of our foodways have been lost. And again, I'm going to use one of those terms, or maybe even both, that most European Americans do not like to hear, but ethnic cleansing and genocide. Part of taking the culture away from people is to take their land and take their lives and their bloods and their livelihoods, but secondarily is to take their language and their food. So if you can control the person's food, you're controlling a whole culture psychologically as well. So a lot of our foodways have been taken or just lost through the reality of reserve life or reservation life. To use the Mohawk people in a context, we were in the Mohawk River Valley, which is just west of Albany, all the way up into the Adirondacks, and we leapt over into Ontario and Quebec. Well, when we were chased kind of out of New York at the end of the Revolution, we were stuck kind of at Akwesasne, where my family's at, and we were not allowed to travel back down into the Adirondacks, where we gathered a lot of our wild foods. So the disconnect there of not just our own foodways of seeds that we saved that we grew, but we also managed forests. So we managed the nut mast in certain areas. We killed the underbrush. We burned those things. So the loss of a lot of that culture is huge. And that's a lot of what I try to do, is to try to piece things together, because as a chef and not just as a caterer chef or somebody that kind of cooks at food events where you have a captive audience, I've spent a career as a chef that has to feed people daily and make money. So that's a completely different concept than having a captive audience than, say, at your dining hall there at George Mason. So you quickly realize that corn in and of itself that we ate almost every day, if we ate it those one or two ways that are given as examples as our food traditions, as our traditional foods, if I had to eat grits every day that were relatively plain, I might stab somebody by the end of the week. So taking that into context, when I'm reading, I look for those things that are lost. So as a forager, I also read a lot of books on foraging, and the amount of credit we get for eating things from the wild is far more than we give ourselves credit for with our foodways. So there's a huge disconnect there, where a lot of folks say, oh, well, indigenous foods are bland. Well, you realize, well, you've taken all of our wild foods as construct. So some of the things that we grow in the garden, and I'll use the Three Sisters as an example, is that I believe those three things are vehicles. Those things are vehicles to the other 20 some odd things that we also planted frequently around our gardens and around our living areas. So the Mexicans used the milpa system, which is the Three Sisters system, is kind of a de-evolution of that whole concept. Or like I like to say, the whole concept of three sisters being important in the story and legends that go along with that are classic to Iroquoian culture. So lesson stories are a big thing. So we tell stories to entertain ourselves in the winter in our longhouses, or we used to, that had meaning. So it was a great entertaining story, but at the end of the story, you come to realize that it had meaning. So the three sisters, I think, is a nice construct of mythology, or however you want to put it. But at the end of the day, it's important that we grow the three sisters together because they grow in a symbiotic relationship. But it's also important from a food sovereignty angle, in that we should also eat those three things together, because nutritionally, there's nothing bigger that provides per acre the amount of power, if you will, or energy, if you will, than those three things. So no other monoculture or polyculture from any society equates to those three things. So when you figure out that we nourished ourselves with those three things as a constant, but added other things in there, though the addition of those other things provide daily flavor or changes in flavor to things. So to use an example, we ate one meal a day generally. I kind of call it brunch because it was, kind of a midday type of breakfast type of thing. We did stuff in the morning and did chores, but there was one pot generally. And we had one community meal, but generally throughout the rest of the day, as you were hungry, you could go back in and you could eat if you wanted, so there wasn't any forbidding of any further eating throughout the day. But as that pot kind of came down, people added things to the pot as they came and went out of the cooking areas. So that corn soup of the morning could change to having greens in it, or whatever else somebody's found in the woods, or has been out in the fields again working, has come back with, say, sunflowers, or the sunflower seeds are dried and they're picking sunflower seeds. Well, the soup needs something else in it. Well, handfuls of sunflower seeds go into it. I sometimes sneak that into a three sisters soup, and it quick makes it a fourth sister. But it's more of that protein as it's going in there. So these are all things that you kind of come across as a chef. And I think that sometimes I often say that the creator picked the right people to save the seeds, because we still have a wealth of seeds there. But the creator didn't always pick the right people to save the recipes. And the seed keepers aren't always the right ones to save those recipes, because they're very, it's almost an additional use of what they're more passionate about. So I try to go at it as being passionate about the food, as of course we appreciate the variety of foods and the tastes and all of that stuff, but our main focus is on people eating it and nourishing people. So I look at things very differently, but I take a lot of what Stephen does and other folks do into context of the next process thereof, and that's storage and feeding people. So Stephen's one of the guys that if I can't figure something out about corn, some of the time I'm messaging him like, hey, I'm stuck here in 1837. Where's this is grown somewhere. Where did it come from? Because European American settlers tend to not care later on beyond Farmer Johnson who grew that corn. So that Farmer Johnson, say, is living in Tuscarora territory. Well, where does he get his corn from? Well, he gets it from the local Tuscaroras generally. So what does he cross to get that corn that's now famous that all of the European American folks are so excited about? Well, I don't know. No, you do know, or you can make a pretty good guess as to where those two corns are crossed. What also isn't acknowledged a lot of the time is that a lot of these farmers were illiterate, so they didn't keep records. They didn't write. So you have to make that intelligent deduction, if you will. And maybe you're wrong with the strain that you're thinking of, but maybe you're right. So, but in reality, you're no different than the supposed expert guessing. But a good guess a lot of the time is if somebody's crossing a corn in an area that was predominantly of another culture, you can guess from their corns, if you know what their corns were, possibly what was crossed, or where that farmer has passed through, even, or at least that's where my guesswork goes. And then that's sometimes where I turn to Stephen and other people that are very much more knowledgeable than corn than I am. So I'm a chef by trade, so I kind of, my knowledge is kind of all over the place, and I know a lot about corn, but and people say I'm an expert, but I don't really view myself as an expert. I just know a bunch of stuff on it. So I know how to cook it. I know how to eat it. I know how it's grown. And I know a lot about history because I enjoy the history. And I think the history should be shaved just as much as the seed. So,
Well, and that's
making hopefully accurate renditions of what people possibly ate is my goal as well, to help rebuild a culture, if you will, or a cuisine. I'm not real big in pan-Indianism, where I'm using food from out west and my own people's foods to create something new that we call as a indigenous dish. I want things that are somewhat true to our cultures. So ramps are eaten, kind of in the southeast and parts of the northeast. I just as I'm seeing it today, I'm seeing fiddleheads. People are talking about fiddleheads. Well, that's a certain type of fern that folks eat, but I get people all the way down here into the southeast talking about eating fiddleheads, and the edible fiddleheads, they don't grow here. But people are talking about it being part of their culture and whatnot, and they're not. Some of the ferns that are here, they're just they're not edible, or pleasantly so. So
what's really interesting about all of it is just how from seeds all the way to table, it's like it really takes a village, and that the village in its large part, all those parts aren't there anymore. And so even just connecting your two work, you get close, but then you still have to make a lot of really good inferences to get there. So we have just a few minutes left. We had a couple questions just relating to crop varieties. And so we have some guests that are curious. Stephen, if you could share what your favorite variety is. And Chef Dave, if you don't mind just kind of weighing in the same way, one of the things we were really interested to share about was just this immense diversity. Folks are aware of the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, but I think might easily overlook just how many different types of each of those there were, and how they were so specific to places and regions. And so as we kind of wrap up and tie things up, we'll just kind of touch on that a little bit, and then we'll kind of wrap up from there.
So when people ask me what's my favorite variety, it's always I'm like Dave. I'll go to corn before I do anything else because I love corn so much, just like he does. But my favorite type of corn depends on what you're wanting to do with it. For sweet corn, a lot of the older corns, which sweet corn is usually a type of corn that most people are familiar with. I usually enjoy the ones like Black Aztec, which is from Mexico, but it is actually the Iroquois black corn that was one of the first encountered by Europeans. It's a very beautiful, very delicious, very antioxidant filled corn, sweet corn wise. Then you have other heirloom sweet corns like Golden Bantam is always a staple. I prefer some of the taller, more productive ones such as Luther Hill and Hooker's Indian, ones like that. For flour corn or grinding corn to make like hominy with, which is what Dave does, I prefer the corns that I group them as just flour corns because that's what they primarily are used for. So being up here in Pennsylvania, we have a corn called Sisapsine, which is one of the indigenous varieties of the Lenape, Delaware. It is a black corn. We will be offering it probably this coming fall through the Ruffwood seed collection as a Three Sisters. So it's probably one of my favorite flour corns. Painted Mountain is one of those that's been modernly created that's good. But I really prefer Tuscarora flour corn, Oneida flour corn, Cherokee white flour corn. They're all really good. They're really productive. They have an amazing productivity, yield, and they just taste good. Gourd seed corn is one of my favorites too, because it was one of the original corns that created what we know as modern dent corn today. And it's good for both hominy, grits, and for grinding and eating fresh.
Beautiful flour.
Yeah, beautiful flower as well. And beans, it depends, again, it depends on what you're wanting. I enjoy a lot of the indigenous beans, the what is called the skunk bean, that is black and white. It's beautiful, it's delicious, it's productive, it's very reliable. We have one in the collection called Wild Pigeon, which I sent Dave. It is a small bean, originally connected to the passenger pigeon that went extinct. And it's super productive. It's kind of like a pinto bean, but not quite. And then squash. I usually enjoy the candy roasters. Their history is a bit questionable if they've been here as long as some sources say they have been. But usually the Cucurbita pepo is what I usually go for, because they are the true indigenous squash of at least North America and Mexico. Cucurbita moscata is as well, but Maximus came from South America, mainly Peru and Bolivia. And when they got to North America, it's a bit of a rough, odd, blurry vision. But we know that Cucurbita pepo, like zucchini and everything, they were domesticated twice, in North America, in the US, and in Mexico separately by like 5,000 years apart. And that's why there's so much diversity, is because when this stuff was spreading, it got isolated, and it had to be readapted. And this new adaptation just created hundreds of thousands of different varieties. Corn alone, globally, the heirloom corn that still exists, there's probably at least 5,000 or 10,000 varieties of corn, which most people don't realize. Beans, probably nearly the same, and squash, probably nearly the same as well. There's a bunch that's probably not even been discovered yet.
Incestuous squash.
And with squash, again, the candy roasters, I like a lot of the Nanticoke squash that I was mentioning. The pineapple squash is one that originated with the native communities up here in Pennsylvania, New Jersey. The one that's falsely called Yugoslavian finger fruit. It is not from Yugoslavia. It is a indigenous squash from the New Jersey division of the Lenape, Delaware, here in the northeast of here. I love it because it's really interesting looking, but it's also high yielding. It makes pretty good sized fruits. And you can eat it young, you can bake with it, dry it, use it as decoration. It's multi-purpose. But before I let Dave pitch in, the key to a Three Sisters garden is using varieties from either the same indigenous group, if you can locate all of those varieties, or a very similar related group. If you're using a indigenous corn with, say, a modernly created bean or modern created squash, it's not going to work. It's kind of the same symbiotic relationship, but it's not the same as growing the original varieties that have been grown together for hundreds of years or thousands of years. It's just not going to work as well. So you do have to be mindful of that. That's why it's not successful for most people, because you can't use like burpee seed to grow a Three Sisters. The original squash was not a bush squash like we have today. That was a European French creation, because Europeans didn't like that squash had hundreds of vines on it. The original patty pans, the original zucchini, the original crookneck squash, they were all vining squash. They were not bush types, because they served a purpose not only as food, but they kept the weeds down in the Three Sisters. They kept the soil shaded to keep it moist, and they were prickly to keep the varmints out of the corn and the beans and everything. So the key is to getting indigenous, putting together a Three Sisters as best as you can with indigenous varieties that is from the same region or the same culture. If you can kind of do that, sometimes it's easier than others. But I'll let Dave take over now.
Take it home, Dave.
If I ever have to pick a corn, I think it's staying true to form here. It's probably one of the flower corns of Tuscarora or Mohawk or Oneida, Seneca varieties. I have quite a bit of Cherokee here in my car that'll go to get planted soon. It's just an incredibly versatile corn. So, you know, you've got flowers, you've got hominy, you've got whole hominy that'll make wonderful soups and kind of hold together. It makes a decent tortilla, even if you're going to head in that direction. I make what we call is Iroquois cornbread. So it's a boiled masa, if you will, masa with beans generally. So it holds together great for that. Though I do use some other flint corns here and there. Again, kind of staying true to form, being Mohawk, there's a lot of us that love red corns. So a lot of different red corns, Tuscarora red, the kind of new questionable Johnny red here in the Southeast is kind of fun. I'm going to be rolling out an organic variety pretty soon that will name after Red Jacket, the Seneca leader. And a lot of what I do is I get as much indigenous or landrace corns as I can get my hands on, and then I have to supplement until I can get farmers growing more things for me. So I've got some talks with some folks up in the Eastern Band in Cherokee, North Carolina, to do some more growing this year. I've got 2 farmers that will be growing gourd seed for me as well. So I should have a pretty good supply of gourd seed because I've committed to buying several acres of it when it's finished. So from that gourd seed, because it's not grown commercially very much anymore, I'm hoping to do a flour and a cornbread mix for the company to kind of have as a flagship, because at one time that gourd seed corn was just the most sought after corn flour to make cornbread. So it makes sense for me to kind of chase that. And if I can get in contact with folks to grow things for me, which is a lot of where my business is based, I would like to have native and indigenous farmers first and foremost, and buying their smaller crops and helping with their grow outs. And hey, I've got to grow my seeds out for climate change. What do I do with all this corn? So, you know, I want to be the place where they just kind of sell everything to at a fair trade price. And we can keep people eating those corns or re-experiencing those corns, and they can also keep that seed strength, if you will, to that corn for the changing, you know, the ever-changing climate. Corns, I mean, again, it's just whatever's on hand and whatever tastes good. You know, because I have a cooking background, you can taste subtle differences in where they were grown and the climates that they're from and whatnot. So it's pretty interesting, the different things that pop out and you go, oh, wow, that's got a lot of this or that's got a lot of that. So as far as squashes, I live in kind of a complicated place for squashes here on the edge of Augusta, Georgia, and South Carolina. So a lot of squash, vine borers, and whatnot. So a lot of folks, if they're growing organically, I don't spray at all. So if it goes, it goes, and that's just how Creator wanted it. But for the past few years, I've been growing a Dutch fork pumpkin, which is, you know, supposedly possibly a Cherokee pumpkin. I think it's a pumpkin that was here in the Southeast that a lot of folks grew because it looks similar to a Seminole pumpkin, and some other examples, some of the ones that the Cherokee are currently growing. So, but it's bigger. So the story behind it is rather sad, and it's about, again, it's back to genocide, but it's about a community coming in and taking over the fields of another indigenous nation that has been chased off or has been massacred. That's not too clear as to what, but all of these pumpkins grown in the field, and they obviously left them for the season because planting season was done, and they loved them. Great meaty, fleshy pumpkins, and I'm sure that they've the folks there in that town have selected them to be a little bit more like our jack-o'-lanterns in size and whatnot. But I enjoy the Seminole pumpkin, but I don't find it has a lot of meat, so I don't grow it, because you get all these vines like you would for, say, growing gourds, taking things over, and then you get, you know, small little squash that, oh, that's not that bad. 2 of us can eat it, and you open it up, and there's a big cavity, and there's only a little bit of meat. So you might be cooking 2 or 3 or 4 of those squash for dinner for several people. And that, when you've only been able to grow 10 or 12 for the season, just, I don't know. To me, it's not worth it. So the Dutch forks that I grow, they're probably my favorite because I can make pies and soups, or I just eat it roasted. I just eat that squash roasted, and sometimes with a little bit of seasoning on it. You know, could be salt, could be pepper, could be butter, a little bit of bacon fat, any type of fat. So these things cry out for it, but it doesn't need a ton of it. It doesn't need sugar. A lot of folks do sweet potatoes. I roast mine in the fire or just in the oven, and our peoples used to eat squash and sweet potatoes right out of the ashes without anything on them, a little bit of salt. So I still do that. So I don't always need big productions with squash, though I do use them all over the place. Beans, my favorite bean probably has to be the true cranberry bean, followed by the borlotti that we're so used to seeing as a cranberry bean. They're just nice and smooth textured beans. It's my belief the true cranberry is what baked beans come from, because it was a pretty big bean there in the Northeast, and you'll see in the next Blue Zones cookbook that'll be about North America. I do a rendition of a true hearth baked bean in a pot in the fire that has maple in place of molasses, and I couldn't really resist not having a little bit of pork fat in there, but it's just because I don't have access to bear fat. These are all different discussions for different days, but that's how deeply I go into things, is that you look at what's missing and what's not. So that's one of my favorite beans. I grew Tyndonega potato beans here as well last year and really loved those. And the runner beans always look great.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap up from here. I want to thank you both, Stephen and Chef Dave, for joining us today, and all the visitors out there who are watching. If this is a program that you really like, or you'd like to support any of our organizations, you're welcome to do so. Gunston Hall, we have the connection for Roughwood Table as well. And just want to thank everyone for coming out again. I'm going to turn it over really quick to Lacey, who's going to share a little bit about some of our public programs. The information that I mentioned is also in the chat. So we're wrapping up here. Lacey, if you don't mind.
Thanks.
Sure. I'm so excited about all of our programs coming up in the next few months. We are connected to this program going to be working on a plant sale in April and May. So look for more information about that on our website. I'm excited to reinvigorate our summer Saturdays this year, which will start in June. And between that, keep your eyes peeled for a few programs that we've got coming up, like our Cocktails by Candlelight. We'll be looking at native Virginia ciders. Not quite as native as what you gentlemen have been talking about. These are English apples that were, brought over, but the historic varieties. And we'll be looking at those in the next couple of weeks as we bring back our Cocktails by Candlelight program. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.